Wow. In some ways, I just want to stay in worship and stay in prayer because there's a lot of times God gets stirring things in a very deep place for me and then trying to move out of that and articulate it. You know what I'm talking about, right? There's times when it's hard then to do that without diminishing. And this is a follow-on from last week because the whole idea about burning grace is just something that is grabbing me. And I feel like it's, I desperately need it. So I hope it's helpful for you. Because I know I need to get this, and God keeps showing me other things. I love this picture, by the way, right? This is just, these are two F-15 Super Hornets out there, and you know, they burn a phenomenal amount of fuel, right? I've been on the phone with my friend and ally who's connected here to the flight deck, Jeff Landers, who's a former F-15 fighter pilot, and so we talk about all sorts of things, including, you know, afterburners on jets and stuff like this. And so it's just kind of, it's very fun. But let me just briefly again, context. In the time in which we are right now is this time that we call the Straits, right? It's between the 17th of Tammuz, which in Scripture is the date when the walls of Jerusalem were breached not once but a second time, and then the 9th of Av, when not once but twice the temple was destroyed, right? And so between that is a 3-week time frame when many Jews will get very superstitious about doing anything. We don't look at it that way because this isn't a horoscope, but we look to those as attention points and say, okay, how is God narrowing things? Because it's connected to the golden calf and, of course, to that refusal to cross over into the promised land. That's what set all the bad stuff in motion. And so the pressure is coming, and we just then pay attention to the narrowing and the pressure and ask, how is God using this? Have you been seeing some narrowing this week? Oh yeah, I mean, you know, right, politically, right? Just the stuff going on, and there's just, and if you're not feeling it, then great. You can pray for the rest of us who are. And again, I don't move in a sense of, oh, we're in this time, this is going to happen to me, right? Okay, that's not how this works. This is God saying, I've put this in my word because I want you to pay attention to it, right? And to me, then, it's a word in time. And so there was a quote last week. I'm going to put it back up here because I want to make sure you got it. If you would really like to be into consuming grace, just lead a holy life.
Amen.
And that's in conflict with a lot of people think that, okay, grace is really just saving grace, and therefore the more I sin, then I get saving grace is more, right? More abundant. And that's not at all. We're talking about grace as a necessity for the next breath you just took, right? And the 5 heartbeats or whatever in between those breaths. And then this line, the true saint burns grace like a 747 burns fuel on takeoff. I just love that line. And it's just got me. Let me give you the rest of this because it's important. Become the kind of person who routinely does what Jesus did and said. You will consume more grace by leading a holy life than you will by sinning, because every holy act you do will have to be upheld by the grace of God. You know, so there's a level that I am needing to move into, a level of awareness of His grace that I want to consume it. Okay? I know this is kind of weird because I've always seen, well, there's only kind of so much grace. You don't want to use it. The grace, you have enough grace for each day and then you get a fresh measure. But I feel like God's saying, son, you have no clue how much I've got. But you're never putting yourself in a position to burn enough. And so I'm going to keep moving on this because I think it's already resonating. Caroline, we already had a couple of email exchanges and had been perking around, and you even talked with somebody else about it, right? A young woman, and you used it as an illustration to try to talk about it. So, and I was on the phone with somebody who just got laid off. You know, and boy, you don't want to be telling them anything when you're just hearing that, right? I just wanted to listen, and I said, look, I need to get into prep, but I'm just going to give you this part. And I very briefly shared. And I think it resonated in a place because that's a person in real need of burning grace, right? The problem is often when everything seems to be kind of fairly fine, and then for a lot of ways we stop burning grace because we don't think we need it. Right? This is the Pharisee problem. I thank you, Lord, that I am not like this guy. I tithe off everything. Right? Okay. So the question again, how much does a 747 burn on takeoff? About 3 tons total. It's over 5,000 pounds. It's close to 3 tons. If you go freighter, it's more than that. 3 tons of fuel burned off. Okay? But the interesting reality is that if it's burning that, it can't burn just that, right? It has something else. And so if fuel is grace, then the intake we talked about is life. Okay? That's coming in. That's life lived. And I want you to know that the mix ratio on a jet is 100 to 2 or 50 to 1. In other words, 50 parts of compressed air to 1 part of fuel. So in other words, if it's consuming 3 tons of fuel, how many tons of air is coming in? How much? 150. There you go. 150 tons of air, compressed air, a lot of air in there, right? That fuel is very potent. And together they combine and they explode. So I want to just, again, without losing you, I just want to show you the mechanics, because all of this, to me, the way that I see, God shows me things often is to show me a picture of something, right? So my friend Jerry Hardis mentioned the aircraft carrier one time in one brief sentence, and you all are in some ways sort of here because of that, right? It's the same thing, that one phrase from Dallas Willard from, by the way, The Great Omission, which is about discipleship. And it just engages me. So here is a turbofan engine. And see the front part, see that big fan going there? That's going to be what draws the air in. All that air is going to get drawn in. But then you see right after it, that part right there, I'm going to go into this next. Let's just watch this. The air is going to go down there through the compressor, It's going to hit here, which is a combustion chamber. That's the combustion chamber there, where it mixes with the air and it's ignited. This is your heart. This is the heart of the engine. This is the heart of a believer. If grace is fuel, that air is the compression of life. And it is ignited by truth. Grace and truth have to be in there, and it ignites. But they have to come together in a very deep place and be mixed. And it doesn't take a lot of it, right? It's a smaller percentage of air that comes down through this compression than goes there. So let me show you some things just mechanically. That fan sweeps a whole lot of air. A whole lot of the air actually doesn't go anywhere close to the center. It just sweeps around the back. It's being drawn in by that fan, and it will combine with the exhaust out the back to provide the thrust. But do you see all these channels along there? How they narrow down? All those are things that are, that's called the compressor. That's forcing the air faster and faster and into tighter and tighter and tighter space. It's compressing a part of life down, tighter and tighter and tighter into your heart. Do you understand what I mean by that? We're going to get to that. But I want you to think about, what does it mean that there's parts that are compressed life that are in my heart? I will tell you, usually a lot of times they're woundings. Sometimes they're great joy, but sometimes they're, okay? And they're part of the critical fuel stock. But all of this is going to lead going up to this, which is that chamber where it mixes on. I spent time all week looking at different videos and studying things about the injectors of the fuel and how they work, and how they spray the fuel and the volume that they throw that fuel in. Think about that, with 4 engines on a 747 that is going through 6 tons in a matter of minutes taking off, right? And think about all the air that's going through that. And that's to lift off, what, a couple hundred people? No, it's more than that. 300 people? Can't remember the actual numbers. But this is where it comes, and then as it goes, it sweeps out and it superheats. That temperature right in there goes to 3,000 degrees. The center part where God has to release grace is intensely hot. Okay? Because there's a purpose for it. And it has to do with motion and with movement, but it ignites. There's like a controlled explosion if we'll let the Spirit meet us in those places. The fuel, the grace. And when it ignites, it comes back here and it hits this part. Those blades are called the turbine. The front part was compressing the air and sort of putting energy into it by making it smaller and smaller and smaller. These parts are taking energy out of the air that's going out. As that energy goes out, it turns those faster and faster. And they're connected up to the very front fan, so then it brings more air in. So as that exhaust goes out, it accelerates it, and that accelerates more of the air, so there's more and more motion. Compressed air, intense matters of the heart. Who will read this out loud, please? Nikki, thank you for volunteering.
Trust in Him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge.
Okay. How about this one? Debbie.
Arise, cry out in the night as the watches of the night begin. Pour out your heart like water in the presence of the Lord. Lift up your hands to Him.
Okay, there's a pouring out. I want you to get, there's this deep part because, well, I'm going to keep going here. Okay, who'll do this next one?
I pour out my complaint before Him. I declare my trouble before Him.
Well, wait a minute. What happened to the, is he not speaking curses against himself? God not know his complaint? God not know what's going on? Sorry, is this in your scripture? It's your Bible? Okay. Those other verses too? Pour out your heart before Him. But see, and so part of the challenge with being me, part of me is a monk and perfectly good to be in reclusive with God, right? And then part of me is like a military captain. I want to see people mobilized and going for it, okay? And I have this need to try to find the balance in it. And the problem is that most of the time I find groups of believers often are very contemplative or they're very warfare minded. And I often feel, okay, wait a minute, I'm too warfare minded for those folks, but I have this other part that sometimes doesn't, you know what I'm saying? Resonate here. It's all kind of press on and do this, and I'm like kind of, well, wait a minute, what, you know. So I try to find these two. And so this is part of where I'm getting at this. But Hannah replied, remember, this is when Hannah is crying out, and Samuel confronts her because she thinks she's drunk. No, my Lord, I'm a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my soul before the Lord. Right? It says she was there, and he looked at her, and he just figured she was drunk. There's this, it comes from this part of our gut, right? There's an inner wail. I want to put forward to you that this is that compressed part. It's the compressed part that comes in there, and it's out of that, and that has to mix in that combustion chamber, which is the heart, with the grace. It just gets suffused with the grace, and then it's ignited with truth. And you might even go, I'm not even sure how that works. Well, go to that place, those places in your heart. Do you know those places in your heart where you still hold that? Some places it's still, go to that and let that come and let a cry rise up, and then just let the grace of God just suffuse it, and just say, Lord, ignite that in me. Burn grace like a 747 on takeoff. Okay? We want to just, you see, there's something in that, because I kept trying to think about what is this compressed life kind of thing, and I think there can be places of great joy in that. But, oh, and this, you know, the woman with the alabaster jar, right? I didn't put all that text up here, but she comes in and just stuns everybody. Because Jesus is eating, and she comes, and what does she do? She starts to weep at his feet. Yes. Whoa, she's just pouring out her heart, right? And then she starts to clean his feet with her hair. And he breaks up in the jar. You know, there's just this, you know, and it's amazing to me. There's a deep compressed part of her heart. Do you sense that? This is not some superficial. And the guy there whose house he's in is just like, well, this guy clearly is not a prophet because he'd know what kind of woman this is. No room for grace. And there's no, you know, the only place he's got is just, okay. You know, he doesn't get that. Samuel, even when he first saw Hannah, didn't get that there was something more going on. And it's out of that place, and it ignites in with truth. So I just want to tell you that I think our hearts for burning grace have to function like this. And boy, I watched some where this guy takes all these jets apart up in Canada, and he's showing the injectors and how it works in this part, and there's a little vortex thing in front of it that actually causes like a mini whirlwind of all the air that comes in, because the air starts out, the air right in this room is about 14.7 pounds per square inch, PSI. By the time it goes through various compressors, depending upon the one, it goes up to 300 PSI. And it's not just pressure, it's heat. According to my F-15 pilot, right? It's the heat that it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. Do you know those hot places in your heart? And you can feel them triggered at any given point in time when you're coming along and you feel this oof. Oh, okay? Do you? Okay. Or that little fear rise up. Oh, there's a hot spot there, Father. There's a hot spot. I just want to release that in grace. Cry out to you, Lord.
Talk about filling air tanks.
Pardon me?
Talk about filling air tanks.
Okay. Talk about filling air tanks.
They have to put them in water.
Okay.
Because when you compress the air in them, the compressed air gets so hot, the tanks would explode if they weren't in the water to take the heat.
Okay. See, I didn't even know that, so thank you. That's why we have you here, the scientist. Okay?
But the opposite is true also.
Okay?
If you release the pressure, it gets cold.
Cold, yes.
Spray a can of hairspray completely out all at one time.
Yeah.
Can just freezes.
Okay. I think that's why a lot of preachers, if you meet them right after they preach, they're really cold. They're hard to... Sorry. You ever notice that? Some guys, boy, they're just like, you want to meet them afterwards, and they're like, oof. You're like, what happened to that person? Sorry, okay. That was just... Okay, so the compressed parts engage the grace of God, and truth sets it on fire. So let me just give you some illustrations. You can see if I'm just totally missing it or not. David, why don't you read this?
But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed.
Are you seeing how the air flows through this part, and it gets smaller and smaller, and then it gets red as it goes through the combustion chamber there, and it reaches out? So hard pressed but not crushed. That reduction. Keep going. Here's the next one.
We are perplexed, but not in despair.
I love this part, perplexed. I'm confused. I don't quite get it all. We have Western mind. We want to understand everything. We have all these systematic theology books because we're desperately trying to get God in the box that we can evaluate. And God's just like, I don't care about your box. Get over yourself. But so we're perplexed. What are you doing, God? I don't get this. Look at all the craziness. But we're not in despair. And walking that line is very important. Keep going, please.
Persecuted, but not forsaken.
More.
Struck down, but not destroyed.
Okay. Are you seeing the compression factor that we're talking about? Okay. Keep going, please.
Always carrying about in the body the dying of Lord Jesus, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body.
See, that death part is that compressed part going down there, getting mixed with grace, ignited by truth, and there's a death that has to happen with a lot of that stuff, because otherwise we'll hold on to it. The self-pity, the depression, the fear, all that kind of stuff that I wrestle with, right? I have to be constantly, the grace. I want to burn grace. So that means I release that in that soup of the grace of God and just say, Lord, ignite it. Because the truth that I have to come to is, God, the truth is you are who you say you are, and I'm still trying to figure out who I am. I don't know most of the time. Right? Because so often I've been so busy trying to be something that I thought I should be rather than being who I am. Right? All the little games, all the little expectation, right? The political correctness, the fear of man, and then the spiritual appearances. Oh, I can't do that. I might alienate that person or this person. I'm like, okay, I can't do that anymore. The grace of God is going to have to so swell up in me so I can deal with myself and get past any imposter and any Pharisee in me, both of which reside, thank you very much. Okay? At any given time, because they come, those parts of me that came in agreement with lies. And too often. And you know what? God doesn't even see those because they're not even real. They don't actually exist except somewhere in here. He's waiting to hear from me. This is the deep cries out to deep. This is that compressed place and that deep chamber. Because see, there's a whole lot of that air that comes at the beginning. It's like your brain, right? There's a whole lot of thoughts and information that comes at you that just doesn't even, you're just flooded by it, right? Only some of it goes down and gets compressed. And it could be a moment like, you know, that one word about burning grace like a 747, that was a compressed, right? That came out, okay. What are you going to do with that, Stephen? I'm going to immerse it in grace and light it up. Keep going here.
For we who live are always delivered to death for Jesus' sake, that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh.
Okay, so this out of the death comes the life, always being delivered that the life may be manifested. Okay, are you tracking with some of this? Joel, can you read this? And you do well with reading, so read it with passion. Psalm 22.
My Elohim, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My Elohim, I cry out this yom, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Kodesh One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a Adam, scorned by everyone, despised by the people.
And this psalm goes on, right? If you haven't hung out here of David, right, that Jesus quotes the first line of. Now you've got to read the rest, but I wanted to give this to you because to me there's this compressed point where all the pressure's in on David. And he's not speaking a curse, but he's crying out his heart. Pour out your hearts at all times to him, right? And let me tell you, I just want to be, because sometimes we can be careful. Well, don't say that. That's a word curse. We have to give some more grace. Sometimes it's just the cry of your heart. It's not a word curse. God, where I don't. But see, then it's suffused with grace. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted you and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. So the grace starts to envelop all of this, but I'm a worm and not a man. So you see this movement? But it's out of that. Read the rest of the psalm and where he lands, right? And it's the first line that Jesus quotes because people would know the rest of the psalm. Which is why then those aren't the last words that he says. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Right? Whoosh. So this mix of there. So here's another thing. If I write, and I'm just using this as a parable, right? Okay, just like the carrier. This is the name of an article I found in Smithsonian magazine, in their flight magazine. And it was titled Flameout. Why the fire in a perfectly healthy jet engine can die. And it's this whole fascinating article about engines. You might get a little freaked out reading it, but because he goes and documents it. Basically, it's very simple. These engines, or in the Air Force, Jeff said, we just always called it the motor. So anyway, the motor needs three things. It needs air, it needs fuel, and it needs heat or fire. Those three things, and it functions. It's complex, but it's not really in terms of what's happening there. Okay? It's basically Newton's law. About every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Which, by the way, is true because it's true biblically. Because John says, we love because he first loved us. For an action, there's an equal, opposite reaction. Do you get that? There's a reaction to it. But it's very important, the order. It's not that he loves us because we loved him. While we were yet enemies and hating him, he sent Jesus to die for us. So he is on the starting part. But I love this line near the very end of the article. Flameouts are a natural consequence of the way jet engines work. Okay? They live on an island of stable operation, a dynamic balance of powerful forces, ringed by a sea of instability. Okay? So let me translate this for you. Flameout. Why the fire in a perfectly healthy heart of a believer can die. Any of you experienced flameout mid-flight in your own life? Do you know what I'm talking about? You're doing well, you're very excited, and all of a sudden, it's just, it's just the flames out, right? And you have to watch who you're around when that happens. So, 3 things. The heart needs 3 things to work. Here you go, okay? Just follow this as a parable. Life, grace, and truth, which are the air, fuel, and the fire. And so let's rewrite that last thing. Flameouts are a natural consequence of the way our hearts work. They live on an island of stable operation, a dynamic balance of powerful forces, ringed by a sea of instability.
Amen.
Okay? Do you get that?
Yep.
And so God has created and set, he put a new heart in us as this combustion chamber. But he requires that we have to operate out of that deep level, but it has to be just infused with grace and ignited by truth. But we have to bring this other part. If we think it's going to run without us dealing that part, without letting that compression happen, like we just heard of Paul, that we are pressed but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair. You know, that part, we have to take that part, immerse it in the grace, ignite it by the truth of who we are and who he is and where he's going, and that we're with him. So, 3 parts. Air, which is life. By the way, you see this? That is one of the 2 intake ducts on this fighter plane, right? The other one's on the other side, just a little bit screened off, but that's right? The fighters are a little bit different than the commercial airlines, but because we talk about this as a carrier and we see you as fighter jets, we're just going to do that. So, 3 problems with air. Or in this case, think about it in the spiritual application with life. One is that it can be contaminated air. In a plane, that means like volcanic ash can go in there, right? And suddenly all that particulate matter in there can shut down the combustion in there. Okay? Because there's not enough oxygen left now. There's all that debris in there. There's particulates, there's birds that can go in there, right? And that stuff can also go in, and because you saw those compressor blades, they look like little rows. They're actually little mini wings that go in there, okay? And they're moving that air. And you know how an airplane can stall if the air is not moving over the wing right? The same thing can happen on those in a turbine. An engine can stall if the air is not moving in it smoothly. Wait, it's got all that big combustion. It can still happen. So contaminated air is one. The other is unstable air. So let me back up. Contaminated air. How's the life you're living, right? If the air is part of that song, this is the air I breathe. Are we breathing that air? Or what are we breathing in? I mean, I have times when I have to stop watching the news.
Amen.
Right? I can't, you know what? I can't, it's got too much contaminant in it. And you know, it's already compressed. Do you understand this? It's already compressed because they are, of all the news and all the great news out there and all the exciting news, they are taking the worst of the worst of the worst and pushing it out at you. Okay? So, now, doesn't mean you don't watch TV. Doesn't mean you don't watch the news, but you've got to be aware that when that's already coming in compressed, you can bring that in and mix it with grace and ignite it with truth. So Lord, I bless the candidates for president. I bless them, Lord. I don't understand all that's going on, but your person. Bring wise advisors, Lord, because they're both going to need them. Whoever's going to be there, they need them. Bring good, great counsel. See, you can ignite. We can ignite. We can sit there and go, oh, crud, what? Yeah. Okay? Where's that going to take me? I have to let the grace, right? Because see, the more that I do that, the more grace I consume. I'm really ready to make bumper stickers. And they're going to say, I burn grace. What about you? Okay? I burn grace. I already looked at reserving the web domain and everything else because I just think it's just key to where I was looking first at burning grace at being, because grace, you're burning grace, but also it's a burning kind of grace. It's amazing. But there's a weird kind of band out there called Burning Grace. So I decided, well, maybe not. And they're not, I don't think they're remotely Christian. Anyway. You getting this? I want you to get the, so the degree to which the air is contaminated, you can get a flame out. Watch the air coming in. Now, unstable air is when there's turbulence in the air, right? And this often happens actually when a fighter plane makes really quick adjustments and corrections, and the flow of air that was coming in is suddenly interrupted. Okay? And now that same flow isn't coming, and what can happen is it actually can get that compressor part that's compressing all the air, can literally just stop. And the fuel that's loaded in there that should be blowing out the back end will blow out the front. Or you get this flame out, go poof, big ball of flame, and the engine just shuts off. Unstable air. And then this one is insufficient air. If you fly too high and the air gets too thin, there's a crash of an Air Canada plane. They were two pilots flying it back to another location. So fortunately, it's the two of them in there. And the plane was designed with a 41,000 elevation limit ceiling, right? So they thought, well, we've never been up that high. Let's just go ahead and take the plane that high. So they put the autopilot on it. And the autopilot was trying to get it up on this degree. It was just following the commands. And it got going. And the more that it got going, and as harder it was because there was thinner air, it started slowing down more. Okay? Because it was following its directions. Stay on this axis, this kind of altitude event, however that is. And I can't think of the word. You know, the angle that they were going. Stay on that to get 41,000, and eventually the air got too thin, and the engine slowed down enough, and it stalled out. Both engines flamed out. They couldn't get them restarted. So it crashed. Okay? So, I want to just, sometimes if we're in too high an atmosphere for too long a time, we're not supposed to be that far removed, right? You ever heard the old phrase, they're so heavenly minded, they're no... Okay, there's reason for that, right? Jeff was very interesting today. He said it's amazing when you get up that high. He said the engines get extremely efficient. You need to burn very little fuel in order to move at that altitude. But he said it's very unstable. You can easily get compression surge, what they call surges, when it locks up at that. You have to be very careful when you're there. And furthermore, he says you never do that when you're worthless for fighting, because you can't turn suddenly or do anything. If you jockey the stick, if you move the throttle up or back very quickly, it can't adjust quickly enough. Anyway, are you connecting dots? So there can be time when you get higher too, there's just not enough oxygen in order to burn right. The higher up you go, right? You know you need oxygen up there. That's why you have masks and stuff, and the engines can't do it. Okay, if fuel is grace, let me give you some things here. Fuel exhaustion is one of the things they talk about. That's when you just basically you run out of gas. Anybody have fuel exhaustion? Okay. You just run out of gas. It's just the way that it goes. Fighters actually run on very thin margins. In other words, they have just enough gas to do what they need to do and get back to the deck of the carrier. If they miss it, they often have to go up and refuel before they can come and try and land again. That's how thin a margin they operate on. Okay? Very specific, very focused on that. So watching the level of gas. You ever run out of gas? Now, they do the in-flight refueling. I'm not even going to talk about that tonight. But here's another one. They call it about fuel exhaustion and fuel starvation. Fuel starvation is when the plane technically has enough jet fuel, but it can't get to the engine because there's a problem in the line. Now sometimes this has happened with airliners when they switch which tank. Sometimes they flip it over to the wrong tank, and they actually flip it over to an empty tank rather than to another one. Okay? But usually what it will happen on this is then if there's water at all in the tank, when they get higher altitude, the water freezes and it comes down and it sinks because it's heavier. Jet fuel is basically all but kerosene. Okay, just so you know, it's not all that sophisticated a mixture, but it'll sit there, and the suction place for the fuel is often at the bottom, so the ice can come and block that. So are there contaminants in our fuel line, right? What's stopping the flow of grace, especially when it first comes to yourself? You might be really good at extending grace to Sarah because you like Sarah and everything else, so that's easy. So there's something wrong, you got lots of grace. It can be a lot more difficult sometimes with ourselves. Anybody want to guess that you don't judge yourself much harder than you would judge Sarah? In fact, if you judged her that hard, right, you'd be embarrassed. You would be literally embarrassed. But the way we do it with ourselves, that fuel has to burn first in us. Okay, and then finally fuel contamination, where there can actually get mixes in there. So what are we letting the grace of God come in? Is this too ethereal, or are you connecting some dots? You getting it? Okay. So, and then of course the heat, the fire has to be truth. I wasn't sure if it was trust, and I was thinking about that. Yeah, I think it's actually truth. David was talking about that, and I'll throw in where I think trust comes in. It's extinguished, that flame, by inadequate air or fuel, okay? Not enough fuel, not enough air in the right mixture. Remember, it's actually a stable function, but surrounded by instability. So one of those two things get off, it goes out. It can also, though, I will tell you this, get extinguished by water. Flying through a storm in certain conditions, if the engine is slow enough, it can bring enough of that water vapor and hail into the engine that it's put out the engine. Some of you are like, I'm not going to fly again. Here's the problem. I think intuitively a lot of believers understand that to really be moving in God's grace means you're going to fly. And there's a fear of flying. Right? If I just stay here in my little pew, do my little thing, go home and keep my head down, no one will shoot at me. Right? I mean that's kind of what God will just give me a pass. I got mine. Okay, so let me get through this. Flame out, now what? Part of the issue a lot of times is with a high altitude flying and going to a flame out, because it's a very efficient use of the fuel, but the thin air causes flame out and we begin to fall. Or because we've gone through contaminated air, and you know what? Sometimes you're just flying just great, and then you run into someone, right? And suddenly you're just sucking. Boy, some of you go home or you have family in for the holidays, and it doesn't take long, right? Every family is dysfunctional. The question is just to what degree, right? And before you look at whoever is the problem, look in the mirror first, right? Because you're bringing your dysfunctions in it, and then they all get to play with each other. Okay, isn't that fun?
And if you're not flying high enough, you crash before you can.
Yeah. Part of it is just being aware of, okay, I'm going into, so what do I need to do in advance? How do I move in here? Right? How do I soar into this? What's my awareness? Okay. So I will tell you, this is from Jeff. This is what you do. If you're in a flame out in a fighter jet, first you do is you throttle back the engines back to just idle. Okay? And then what you do is you immediately point your nose down. And you start to pick up speed. The reason being, do you remember at the front of that engine was that big fan? Okay, with a stall, that thing stops moving. So the first thing you got to do is get that fan moving. So you point your nose down and you start to pick up speed, and that starts to work like a windmill. Okay? And at that point, he says you got to really watch the RPMs. When the RPMs get to the right level, then you can reignite and get going. On commercial planes, they have a function where it'll do actually continuous ignition. So here's my parallel then, right? You're flying and you have flame out. The first thing you got to do is throttle back to idle and point your nose down. Some people call that carpet time, right? You got it. You go. Okay. Just let God move in you. Lord, I got too thin in the atmosphere there. Do you know what the reason? If the compression, somehow that means that we're not dealing with enough of the deep stuff of life that we have to be bringing, right? People that are too isolated are in too thin an atmosphere, too rare an environment. Okay? That's the challenge with the monk part of me. If I'm alone too much, it's really dangerous. part of that, God can meet me in that. Part of it is just the air gets far too thin, right? I have to be around with other people and with life, engaging that. And it provides a big part of the fuel in me if the grace of God is meeting it by the truth. So, another case in point. Two guys walking back after the crucifixion. As far as they know, Jesus is dead and buried. They've heard rumors about something else, but they are thoroughly discouraged. And so they're talking about it. They're dragging their feet. Their heads are down. And he asked them, that would be Jesus, what are you discussing together as you walk along? I'm just pulling out parts here. Of course, they stop and they look at him. Their faces are downcast. They ask him, are you the only one who hasn't heard? But they go and they talk about it. But this is the key line. We had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. I want you to see this compressed air in them, in their hearts. Do you see the sorrow right there? And what Jesus is doing is he's calling it up. He's actually do you think he didn't know, right? Why didn't he just go, hey guys, I'm here, look. Right? He does something. He does something. He's playing with their hearts and he's getting them to draw that in to that point. Go to that pain point. I want you there because we thought he was the one. Oh, I thought that was the situation. Oh, I thought that person was to be my whatever, wife, husband, best friend, partner. Where's the I thought that business opportunity. Oh, I thought that church. Oh, I thought that. Okay? You got it. But then Jesus starts to inject fuel. There's grace and truth coming out. Mostly this is the way he's doing it is grace, but he's sparking truth in there. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them all in the scriptures the things concerning himself. And then of course he disappears, right? Poof. In the midst of what? Breaking bread. At that moment, it says their eyes were opened. And I want you to see this line. Were not our hearts what? Burning within us. While he talked to us on the road and opened the scriptures to us. But see, it didn't fully ignite until suddenly they saw him, because that was the context of grace. Look, guys, it's not only true, but I'm here telling you myself. You get, okay? You can have a lot of truth spoken to you, and it doesn't, and you're trying to receive it, but you can't. And suddenly, right? It just comes, and suddenly their hearts just, and you know why we know? Because they're propelled. Where? They got up and returned at once all the way to Jerusalem. Right? They're on fire.
You know, I look at it and I go, Jesus was pointing them right back to truth. All of the life was still there. The grace was still there. But they didn't have that ignition point. And he knew that he wasn't going to always be there to explain it to them. So he said, look, this is what it was all about right here. And truth is what they needed.
Yeah. It was, but they also, here's where you're right. It's truth what they needed, but they needed it in the context of how and who he was. Right? We have hit people over the head with truth forever. And that's why the church is largely where it is. It's largely where it is seen as judgmental, condemning, and hypocritical and everything else. Or then as a reaction to being seen that way, we pull back and we no longer hold to any truth. Right? Then we just kind of like, whatever, fine. Country club kind of thing, you know. So I think there's something about the way he does it. So here's another part, wounded healers. Remember that combustion chamber. This is Paul saying, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. This is about the thorn in the flesh. But he said to me, you quoted this last week, David, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Right? Do you see this? But here I want to ask you this. The 3rd time, Paul seeks God 3 times, right? And the reason this was given to him, it says, is because he got such amazing revelation. Right? That to keep him from getting a fat head, God had to temper him. And so this was given. So, do you think after 3 times, when he finally heard a word from the Lord, I'm not going to take it away, my grace is sufficient, do you think he was ever bothered again by this thorn in the flesh? Oh yeah, you can bet. Right? That's one of those compression areas. But see, now he's got truth to speak into it and the grace, and now he can burn grace because he knows that that weakness is what? My power is made perfect in weakness. So then he goes on, therefore I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest in me. That grace and truth meets me in that place. Not in the place of strength, not in the place that everything's happy-go-lucky. Just like us a lot of times. When everything's great, God's kind of like somewhere on the perimeter. And we may say, oh, God is good. Isn't God great? Yeah, we kind of believe it. But there's a part of us that's like, yeah, I'm doing great. You know what I'm saying? Israel always was that way. It's why they went in the cycle, why they always had to be handed over, because God would redeem them and then things would get good and they'd forget. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, for in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul knew how to burn grace like a 747. So here's an interesting question. Why does the body of Jesus still have holes in it? Why weren't they healed over? He's got a resurrection body, right?
I have a question back. Why did they need to be healed over?
Well, they're wounds.
And so
Yeah.
we got to go on with the one.
Okay, yeah. But it's very interesting that the risen Savior is very content in showing you his woundedness as a demonstration. Right? Do you get this? The reason I'm saying it, because there can be a real temptation as we're trying to move forward and see what God has for kingdom to not be extremely candid about our wounds. And I see Jesus having no problem with them. Thomas, hey, here you go, buddy. Put it right there, bud. Whole new meaning to put it there, bud. Put your finger here. Put your hand on my side. Go ahead. You know Thomas looked, right? So did all the other guys. They just didn't have the courage to do it. Okay. Trust is engaging the throttle. Trust is what happens in here when you make the decision to move forward. What the throttle does is it increases the fuel rate in there, which increases the temperature of the burn, which means that turbine moves faster, which means it draws in more air, which means there's more of that compressed part that comes in, and that accelerates more and more and more. But there's one other part. Because to burn grace, you've got to have it on the front end of the engine, but if you're a fighter pilot, then this is what you live for. It's called an afterburner. After all that gets burnt out and it goes through that turbine and it goes out the exhaust, while it's sort of trying to creep out the back, right? It's got a lot of unused oxygen in it. And so in an afterburner now they inject fuel and ignite it. It's a secondary thing and it kicks. So if you're going to burn grace like a fighter pilot, you live for throwing on the afterburner and having it throw you back. In fact, in an F-15, according to Jeff, I think there's 5 different rings of them, and they kick on. He says, you can feel it. And boy, you are burning fuel like a banshee. Okay? I need you to understand, we have to be in that difficult place to bring that compressed air for the first thrust. But then by God's grace, by the Spirit, those afterburners kick in, and it's not efficient use of fuel. It burns fuel like mad. Do you think God is worried about you burning too much grace? He's just going to be able to go, look at her go. So the afterburner uses boatloads of fuel. It brings boatloads of thrust. You want to be using more and more grace. It's not, quote, efficient, but it is necessary. And you know what? You know when a fighter plane uses this is when they're lifting off from the deck of a carrier and when they're in combat. Because they need that in order to the quick maneuvering. Because when you got to maneuver quick and everything else, you need that extra thrust and speed. So, I burn grace. Say, I burn grace.
I burn grace.
Will you please commit to burning more grace, please? That means being more you. Which means I'm going to have to burn more grace towards you probably. Okay? But we have to stop We have to be more and more ourselves, more bold to say. There's got to be more at times cry from the heart. Don't shut someone down when that's coming out, okay? You got to let some of that cry is let that place, but then let the grace mix in there, right? There's an ignition point at that place of pain. When I am weak, then I am strong. There's a time we have to get down to that, right? To let it really ignite. Paul says, all the more therefore boast. If I had to change, boast of my wounds, right? At the power of God. So in the time of through the straits, in a time of focusing on things getting narrowed, pressure being increased, you just need to be aware of how that then operates in the chamber of our hearts and let it ignite. Got it? Let me pray. Open your hands. I want you to just say to the Lord, I will burn more grace.
I will burn more grace.
I promise. Now y'all realize that means you're going to have to let God show you those pressurized places in you, right? Where that stuff's coming into you. You don't ignore it. You don't deny it. You don't try to push it away. You go, oh wow, okay. There's something here that can help burn the fire of God in me. That has to be there along with the grace ignited by truth so that we can move forward. Father, I just pray that we become a people that burn grace. Just burn grace, Father. First towards ourselves, because somehow we got to become more who we are rather than trying to be someone else that you don't even know because you never made that person. And so, Lord, help us do that. More freedom, more joy, an ability to weep and laugh and leap and crawl when necessary, Lord. Just whatever's going on. Lord, the world is hungry for authenticity. People who really know that they have that brokenness and that wound and speak from that place and in authority. And Lord, let us be ones like Jesus who can set the hearts of other people on fire by what we release and how we release it. Lord, it's got to be your grace. Help us to be an instrument then, to communicate that and to be first and foremost a living proof and evidence of that. Father, I thank you that Jesus still has his wounds, the places where he took it. And Lord, those are glorious. Those are glorious. Lord, you have a similar design for places where we've been wounded. If we will let you move through those as a means of strength. And so we submit to you afresh. In the name of Jesus. Amen.